to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Boland. Today, we are joined by my friend Jacob Vidrine. Jacob has actually been on the podcast before discussing Joseph Smith's theology of the restoration of animal sacrifices and other issues, and also to give a recap of a debate he had against two polygamy deniers about a year or two ago as well. So, yeah, Jacob, thanks for coming back to the podcast. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be on, Robert.
Yeah, today we will be discussing Mormon fundamentalism. Hopefully, we will put the fun back into fundamentalism. But Jacob, how about you give an introduction to yourself? In the show notes, I will include a link to One Eternal Round, which is Jacob's publication, but also his new website on debunking polygamy denial. So maybe if you were to give like an introduction, like your religious background and like your websites and what you do as well. So before we kind of delve into this particular topic specifically.
Okay, well, I think briefly covered it before. I'm really passionate about Mormon history and theology, and I really kind of started really getting into it when I was about 19, 20 years old. And I was raised mainstream Latter-day Saint. I had a very positive experience growing up in the LDS church, and I thought great communities, great wards, really great foundation in the gospel. As an adult, I from studying some of the history and some of the doctrines, I instead chose to become a Mormon fundamentalist. And it's from I can see both the pros and cons to Mormon fundamentalism from from a practical perspective, from a historical perspective, and it's just a very fascinating, not just theologically, but the history is very rich and very fascinating regarding the history of Mormon fundamentalism, how it started, how it grew, and the various groups and what they believe. And so that's something that I'm pretty passionate about studying alongside studying early Mormonism in general, because that's really where my kind of focus is I really have a passion for what Joseph Smith taught, what Brigham Young taught, what John Taylor taught. I consider them like the first three founding prophets of the Restoration, and with amazing character, and I really look up to them and their teaching. So that's kind of how I got into really taking fundamentalism seriously. But I'm also into studying Mormon history and into the historical community, also into apologetics to a degree. I'm not the most up to date in studying what apologetics are going on against, say, like Protestants and other anti-Mormon attacks on the Restoration, but that's another area I'm interested in. But I am very interested in staying up to date with the Mormon history community. I actually had somebody a few days ago ask me what's my favorite topic to study in Mormon history. And I actually would, and I hadn't thought that question before, but I thought it was a good question to ask yourself. And for me personally, the history of the temple rites and the temple ordinances and how those developed, and how, there's just a very rich history to those. But what's kind of sad is that there's so many other projects I'm working on that's actually an area that I haven't got to spend as much time researching as I would prefer. Right now, I've been kind of juggling three different subjects, and we've interacted on several of these. One of them is Joseph Smith's polygamy, responding to the polygamy deniers. Both mainstream and fundamentalists can kind of agree that Joseph Smith definitely practiced polygamy, and in contrast to those who would try to argue otherwise and kind of resurrect the RLDS arguments against what I would say is Nauvoo Mormonism that Joseph Smith was teaching and practicing. So that's a big project, and I just launched a website this last week, debunking and it's short, it's sweet, it is just includes a couple of web pages now, but there will be more in the future dealing with some of the various issues on that. So Joseph Smith's polygamy is one, then that's actually not even a topic that I would be very interested in. It's only come up because of the demand. That's been such a controversial discussion online about, with the resurrection of the polygamy denial movement. But I've also done a lot of research on the Adam God doctrine and giving presentations on that. And I've also been working on researching and writing on fundamentalist priesthood history. And so those are kind of the three topics I've been juggling all at the same time. But I hope eventually, to wind it, Robert, we're going to probably have a dialogue on Adam God specifically.
Yeah, we'll be having that later this year. So yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that discussion because Robert's very well studied on Adam God, and
although I do
really,
got a feeling we'll probably end up agreeing more than most people will actually expect. But yeah.
yeah. So I'm out of curiosity, is the B.H. Roberts? You mentioned that there was a version 2 of the Adam God article on the B.H. Roberts Mormon R website. Is that one? And you said over 1,000 sources. Is that one out yet? Or
no, we have to get. We're waiting on the editor to actually get back to that, but it will be. When it's uploaded, it will be like over 1,000 sources. I found a lot of stuff since it was initially published. So yeah.
Yeah, so we're both very interested in that subject. We're interested in apologetics to the polygamy deniers, and we're also, so today I guess we'll be getting into some of the nitty-gritty of and details of fundamentalist history. So that's something that I'm excited and passionate about as well.
Sure. I've also been asked this by some people. So like, if you're willing to share, like, what strand of fundamentalism would you actually adhere to?
So I think I mentioned it before, but I consider myself a Ross LeBaronite, and some people are like, "Well, what is that?" And I think Brian Hales on an old he used his MormonFundamentalism.org website is a pretty good primer for mainstream Latter-day Saints to kind of have a idea about fundamentalist beliefs and practices. But he had an older version of that website that had a bit more detail, a bit more content. It was maybe a bit more aimed at the historian or academic interested, I think. And he wanted to make the website more accessible to a general audience. But he actually covered so many. I think Brian is a talented historian in his research, not just on Joseph Smith's polygamy,
great. Yeah.
but also on Mormon fundamentalism. And so he actually had a page on Ross LeBaron, and I thought was actually really well written. I thought it was fair. It kind of just touched on him very briefly, but it said this. He said, so it's just a short four paragraphs about. So Ross LeBaron, within months of organizing the Church of the Firstborn of the fullness of times, and that's the LeBaron Church that was organized in September of 1955. Disagreements arose, causing Joel and Ross to part ways. On December 1st, 1955, Ross Wesley LeBaron incorporated his own church, simply calling it the Church of the Firstborn. During the ensuing decades, Ross remained in Utah and quietly promoted his own church, cultivating a small group of followers. When asked in an interview on July 25th, 1959, concerning his priesthood authority, Ross stated that he was ordained by his father in March 1950, and that Joseph W. Musser confirmed the patriarchal priesthood of Dare LeBaron the same day. Reportedly, at one time, Ross lived in a storage unit with a dirt floor. His beliefs extended beyond the doctrines of the Restoration to include UFOs and other extraterrestrial beings. Often invited to speak on local radio talk shows, most people considered him eccentric but harmless. Ross's significance was enhanced through the attraction of three young followers, Fred Collier, Tom Green, and Robert Black. All three of these disciples assisted Ross in exchange for an opportunity to learn his teachings. Fred would become a prolific writer and proponent of plural marriage. During the 1960s and 1970s, with the help of his wife, Bonnie, Fred successfully acquired unauthorized copies of many documents that were smuggled in and out of LDS church archives. His copies of documents, journals, discourses, and early biographies would form the basis of many of his later publications. Tom Green would become famous or infamous for his own endeavor to publicize his own polygamous activities. Tom believed Ross possessed an incredible depth of knowledge regarding patriarchal authority. After the death of Ross Wesley LeBaron, all three, Collier, Green, and Black, would each claim they were the recipient of Ross's priesthood keys. And so that's how that short little excerpt he wrote on Ross was written. And I kind of, we'll probably talk more about this kind of near the end of this discussion when we get kind of into the priesthood, succession, and ecclesiology of fundamentalism. But I think Ross had probably the most compelling claim out of the LeBaron line of claims that were made by the various LeBaron brothers. His And I thought his theology in some interesting ways matched some of the things that Joseph Smith believed and taught about priesthood and Nauvoo. So that's kind of my personal background. So it's almost like an independent, but not quite an independent. So I think, so I've been referred to, I think, as an independent fundamentalist. I don't believe that's quite an accurate label. It's more of a loose family organization is what Ross's Church of the Firstborn was established to be, where it's men received authority for their families, and you still kind of had to be accountable to the man who ordained you, etc. So it wasn't really quite as loose as independent fundamentalism, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's perfect. So, of course, we'll be discussing generally Mormon fundamentalism, and well, however you want to start, we can go about that.
So I guess a good place to start with Mormonism is kind of going back to why the succession crisis and why Brigham Young was the best option out of all the different claimants to be Joseph Smith's successor. Because, if you read, I think D. Michael Quinn wrote a couple articles on succession, Nauvoo. There are different ideas about how succession should go. For example, there was David Whitmer, who kind of claimed that he was, and actually Joseph Smith said that he had ordained David Whitmer early on in the church, that if he were to apostatize, that David Whitmer was his appointed successor. And then there was the claim, Sidney Rigdon was there from the beginning of the church in the first presidency. There were some who thought Sidney Rigdon was the rightful person to be the next president of the church after Joseph's death. There were a variety of other claimants that were made. James Strang made a claim. Lyman White broke off and started his own group in Texas. Alpheus Cutler started his own group. He broke off a little bit later than Lyman White. William Smith broke off also and started his own little schism. And so I think there were a variety of reasons why Brigham Young, in my opinion, was the best succession option. I think a lot of people think it's just simply it fell to the Quorum of the 12 as the highest quorum in the church. But Emma actually thought that the William Marks, as the president of the Nauvoo High Council, had an equal kind of claim to be the successor, was at least kind of Emma's opinion that she was sharing with people in 1844 and 1845. But so Joseph had intended, he had appointed his brother Hiram or his brother Samuel to be in charge of the church if he were to die. And there's a number of sources that state that, particularly Brigham Young at the October 1844 General Conference said that Joseph had ordained Hiram to take his place if he were to die. But Hiram died before Joseph. And so I think there were a couple of reasons. So obviously being in the Quorum of the 12, it was one of the presiding quorums of the church. And I do think that was a big factor. And Brigham Young had magnified his calling as an apostle and doing missionary work and striving to do whatever Joseph Smith, as the president of the church, called him to do. But then I think there were other factors that made Brigham Young a really great succession option. I would say he was involved with Joseph Smith's new theology that he was introducing in the Nauvoo period. He was in Joseph Smith's secret councils that he was organizing during the last a couple of years of his life. The Anointed Quorum in 1842, where Joseph began to reveal the temple ordinances, and in 1843 and 1844, Joseph gave men in the Anointed Quorum, the select men who were the closest and most faithful, the fullness of the priesthood. And Brigham Young was one of those men who received the fullness of the priesthood, or all the priesthood keys that one man could give to another man, which Joseph had received from Elijah in the Kirtland Temple. So the sealing keys obviously were encompassed in that authority. And then he was also a member of the Council of 50 and one of the priesthood brethren who had received a charge in the Council of 50 to see that Joseph Smith's teachings and the church and kingdom were carried off triumphant to the world. And Joseph gave the last charge speech where he said, I'm going to go rest a while. And so with the Council of 50 Minutes release, a lot of people expected Joseph Smith's last charge to be recorded in the minutes. And unfortunately, it wasn't, and so we think of the last charge as being to the Quorum of the 12 to carry the burden of the church. And that's where they often talked in the 1840s and sometimes later on about their claims to authority. But when you actually look at the Council of 50 Minutes in 1845, they kind of say the last charge was actually to the entire Council of 50. And so I don't think that actually hurts Brigham Young's succession claim at all. I know John Dinger wrote a paper trying to argue that against the last charge being an important aspect of Brigham's authority. But I would just say that, to keep it simple, he was initiated into Joseph Smith's new teachings and theology, eternal marriage, plurality of gods, etc., temple ordinances. He had received the sealing keys and fullness of the priesthood, and he had received a charge to bear off the kingdom, and he was faithful to those teachings that Joseph Smith had restored, while others, such as William Marks, was not, rejected some of Joseph Smith's later theology. And so I think I really think that you'd call it didactic succession, that continuity is in teachings is probably in my opinion, one of the compelling reasons that I think Brigham Young was a great successor to Joseph Smith. And there was differences between Brigham and Joseph, but when you compare Brigham Young's theology and his teachings to, say, Sidney Rigdon or James Strang or any of the RLDS Church, when Joseph III stepped forward to lead that, Brigham is the only one that actually cares about, the apostles are the only ones that are really concerned about preserving that Nauvoo theology that Joseph Smith was restoring. And so I think that Brigham Young was absolutely the best man to kind of hold the church together. And I think that through the Transfiguration experience, on August 8th, 1844, when they did the special conference regarding deciding the succession in the church, where Rigdon was trying to get the church to sustain him as guardian, Brigham Young stood up after Rigdon spoke, and the Lord showed those saints who had the Spirit that, through Brigham Young looking and sounding like Joseph Smith, that Brigham was the right man to carry on Joseph Smith's work. And that, transfigurations are kind of, I had a friend share an interesting article about spiritualism and how transfiguration is a common, actually it's not a super common, but it is something that has occurred in some spiritualist movements as a manifestation or a miracle, where one person can look like another, but they aren't well documented. But in Brigham Young's case, this is probably the most well documented instance of a transfiguration we have in church history. I mean, in world history, probably what we have, where there's hundreds of accounts. And I actually did a presentation on this where I showed that there's accounts going back to 1844 and 1845 in Nauvoo. And some of them kind of spoke of it as like, he was, even in 1845, that they still thought Brigham Young looked like Joseph Smith. I think that was evidence that the spirit of Joseph was kind of with him and kind of helping him carry on his work, is kind of what I personally believe about that. So in contrast to some people who try to argue the transfiguration didn't happen, I think that, there's some compelling evidence that it did. And I think Robert has shared an excerpt on his blog on the transfiguration with some of the quotes or arguments that I've compiled on that. So
yeah, just on the transfiguration, like Jacob does actually have an entire issue of One Eternal Ground just on that particular topic. So yeah.
Yeah. The paper was called Succession to Brigham Young. And I talk about that miracle, and then also the manifestation in December 5th, 1847, for the apostles to reorganize the first presidency, that they actually felt there was that they got the voice of God. They felt the Spirit strongly compel them that this was the right thing to do. And as an external manifestation of this experience, some of the local residents felt that there was an earthquake, is what those accounts. And some people discount that story because there's only a couple accounts in the 1860s about that experience. But Brigham first mentions it in a private meeting of the Quorum of the 12 as a shock that shook the neighborhood, in an argument why Orson Pratt should kind of support him instead of kind of be arguing against him. And so I don't think Brigham would be mentioning that in an argument with Orson Pratt if it wasn't something that he genuinely felt or remembered had happened. And so, yeah, I think that there were manifestations of the Lord showing that Brigham Young was, the right one. And you don't even have to focus on, say, the higher teachings relating to temple ordinances baptism for the dead, eternal marriage, and some of that Nauvoo cosmology. But even if you go back to some of the basic principles that Joseph Smith taught, like the importance of missionary work being a extremely important aspect of the restored gospel, gathering and building, Zion communities, those kinds of principles were things that Brigham Young perpetuated better than anyone else. And, Brigham, the apostles published a lot of Joseph Smith's unpublished revelations, and they preserved the records of the church as much as they can. And they, the history of the church wasn't a perfect history. Were, it was based on the context of where they were, but they really did try their hardest to preserve so much of Joseph Smith's life and the documents and the sources and the information relating to Joseph Smith. So I do think that there are a lot of reasons that Brigham Young was the best succession option in the succession crisis. So where fundamentalism departs from the mainstream LDS church, you go down to John Taylor, and they all accept John Taylor. And then after John Taylor, that's when it gets fuzzy with depending on which fundamentalist group you have. But we all generally agree that, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor were the prophets of God who held the keys of the priesthood and presided. And then fundamentalists have different succession schisms after that. And I think that's something that we'll go into detail. But I think that for the sake of understanding fundamentalism, we need to understand kind of some of the doctrinal reasons behind fundamentalism, some of the doctrinal emphasis that fundamentalists have. And they really, I've seen some people accuse fundamentalists of quote mining, and I don't think that's the most charitable or accurate term, because I do think fundamentalists to a large degree are just really emphasizing things that they see and notice in, say, Brigham Young's teachings or John Taylor's teachings that they felt the church later on kind of either, put on the back burner, kind of downplayed, or later ended up rejecting it. And so that's kind of the source of the fundamentalist movement. And I would say that, there's a decent discussion to be had, Robert, about, about how much weight should be put into prophetic utterances of church leaders. You have a book, Not by Scripture Alone, which is, I guess, borrowing from a Catholic. Catholics made that argument, not by Scripture alone, right? And you make the case for the open canon or the continuing canon for Revelation to be added to it. And I kind of actually borrowed that title for a presentation I gave once on Not by Scripture Alone, the need for continuing revelation. And in that, I kind of take the need for continuing revelation, that it's not just the canonized, accepted by all the quorums of the priesthood teachings, but we should be looking for the inspired teachings of church leaders, regardless of whether they are canonized or not, is kind of my personal perspective. And I've heard some people say with the New Testament, part of the reason we accept the epistles as legitimate isn't because there was some sort of litmus test of, do we think that the apostle was correct in teaching this X, Y, or Z, but it was, they accepted them as authoritative because they were the apostles and they held the authority to kind of lay down and establish teachings. And so I, in a very similar way, view the teaching, the teachings, inspired teachings of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor are, in my view, on par with Scripture. And that's kind of where the fundamentalist emphasis comes in, where they will be really citing, say, the Journal of Discourses or uncanonized revelations that John Taylor had as authoritative, because they see that inspired teachings are not limited just to the ones that are accepted by the church. And there's a statement to defend this by George Buchanan in 1891, where he said, regarding unpublished revelations, that a revelation from the prophet was authoritative whether the body of the church accepted it or not. And I thought I had that quote right here, real Yeah, here it is. It's in the Juvenile Instructor on January 1st, 1891. He said, it seems so. This guy was arguing that for a revelation from the prophet to be authoritative, it needs to go through all the quorums of the church and be accepted. And George Buchanan kind of disagreed with this idea. And I think he's kind of pushing back because Joseph F. Smith actually was one of the people who was promoting this idea that it needed to go through all the quorums to be authoritative. And so George Buchanan kind of had a difference of opinion on this, where he said, it seems nonsensical that the prophet of God should submit to such a test as this and not deem the revelations he received authentic until they had the approval of the different quorums of the church. They were authentic and divinely inspired, whether any man or body of men received them or not. Their reception or non-reception of them would not affect in the least their divine authenticity, but would be for the people to accept them after God has revealed them. In that way, they have been submitted to the church to see whether the members would accept them as binding upon them or not. Joseph Smith himself had too high a sense of his prophetic office and the authority he had received from the Lord to ever submit the revelations which he received to any individual or to any body, however numerous, to have them pronounce upon their validity. And so that was kind of his argument. And Fred Collier actually includes that statement in the front of Unpublished Revelations. Is that statement included at the front of Stephen Smoot?
Just speaking of like uncanonized revelations, my friends Stephen Smoot and Brian Passantino, their book is out. I got this from Smoot himself today. Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations. So I just thought I'd plug it for my two friends. But they do actually quote canon in the introduction as well about the value of non-canonized revelations as well. So
cool. Yeah, that's great. I'm excited to read that since that's coming, just barely coming out. So I think there are definitely nuances you can take to this issue, not just of whether it needs to be accepted by a quorum to be binding or not, but also, the question of prophetic fallibility. Can a prophet err in some of his teachings? I think that's another nuance that you could have to this discussion. So, that there's a lot of fascinating aspects to it. So with fundamentalists, they really emphasize 1800s Mormon teachings, and they really kind of hold fast to, and you can almost this almost could be seen as a weak point for a lot of fundamentalists, where they don't. So Brigham Young and John Taylor and then the early apostles emphasized we're having continuing revelation that's building upon what Joseph Smith taught. And we're continuing with this channel, the living oracles, as Brigham Young said on one occasion, recalling that Joseph emphasized the need for living, continuing revelation. And fundamentalists, to some degree, often they'll emphasize the old oracles. They'll say, look at all these things that Brigham Young and John Taylor taught and said were revealed teachings, but then they don't really have too much continuing revelation beyond that. They're kind of more just hearkening back to the old teachings. But I do think, to understand fundamentalism, you need to understand what some of those emphasized old teachings are. And so, probably four of them that I would say are agreed upon by most fundamentalists, and then I'll have four more that are kind of agreed upon by many fundamentalists, if not the vast majority. So the vast majority of fundamentalists believe in the early Mormon emphasis on plural marriage as a commandment from God, and they felt that it was a principle of exaltation that that needed to be continued no matter what. They emphasize the united order and the gathering is another one. The third one that fundamentalists usually agree on, I could say that this one isn't as clear in early Mormon teachings, but this is something that fundamentalists, almost universally believe in, is this idea that priesthood and salvation can exist outside of the church. So that's kind of rejecting. Do you have the Latin word for that word that the Catholics use for that term?
You mean salvation outside the church, like extra ecclesiam nullum salus or something like
that? Yeah, that kind of view. So rejecting that is kind of almost a universal fundamentalist perspective, because they believe that somehow they're getting authority, somehow the authority comes out of the church and they're still doing, still saved in some degree. So that's something that they really emphasize. And then most fundamentalists would agree on probably the Adam God theology of Brigham Young would be, and so plural marriage, united order, priesthood outside of the church, and Adam God are the four that I'd say the vast majority agree on. Then four more teachings that they have, that fundamentalists have, that probably the majority of fundamentalists agree on. I'm not sure if I know that there are some groups who downplay them to various degrees. So rebaptism is another one that fundamentalists are generally pretty big on. The idea of the original garment pattern, that in early Utah there was a one-piece jumpsuit garment, the Union suit, that was made in a specific design and went to your wrists and your ankles. And a lot of fundamentalists viewed the church as erring in starting to permit other shorter garment lengths and other patterns, starting with Heber J. Grant in the 1920s. The priesthood ban is one that probably the majority of fundamentalists agree with, though there are at least one group around that today that reject it. And there's the proper method of priesthood conferral, which is another one that the fundamentalists. This is something that I would actually argue against being a early Mormon teaching. That I think it's more of a fundamentalist folk. I think it was a folk belief that some early Latter-day Saints had, that the priesthood needed to be conferred using a specific wording. And if that exact wording wasn't followed, that you're only getting an office, you're not actually having the priesthood conferred upon you. I'm not sure if you've heard of that issue before, Robert, or not.
Not amongst fundamentalists, but like say when Roman Catholicism, they're very strict when it comes to say the necessary words to effect a sacrament. So like there's like strands of Catholics who believe if the exact wording is not used, you don't receive a sacrament. And if it's like priesthood or baptism, that really screws you over if it's not found out straight away. So yeah. So
okay, so that's something in
format.
Catholicism. Yeah. So I remember reading that story a few years ago where a Catholic priest was using like one word off in this baptismal formula. I think.
Like we baptize you as opposed to I baptize you, and that means it's not a valid baptism. And I know, like in Arizona, I know this is a bit off topic, but it's still interesting. There was a priest who looked at the video of his baptism and realized he was not actually validly baptized. The priest had used the plural, not the singular pronoun. So it turns out he wasn't actually ordained a priest at all. And
because he wasn't baptized.
Yeah, and that would kind of like raise questions. And I'm sure there's some questions raised in fundamentalist communities here. It's like, well, how do you know for a fact that it did take place in this course? There's a video recording, and if there's like a serious doubt, like that will affect all the other ordinances you yourself either participating or confect as well. So
yeah. So in the fundamentalist kind of perspective on this is in Heber J. Grant, they set the proper the wording of ordination to be I ordain you to this office, and I confer upon you the keys, rights, of authority pertaining to that office. Is kind of the just from memory remembering what that wording was. And they said that that wording doesn't actually, so the fundamentalist perspective is that wording doesn't actually confer the Melchizedek priesthood if you're, say, ordained to the office of an elder, and no mention is made of conferring the Melchizedek priesthood. So they really emphasized that before, that it was that the wording of an ordination was I confer upon you the Melchizedek priesthood, I set you apart to this office. And what fundamentalists don't really realize on this and is that wording being the set standard didn't start until Joseph F. Smith. This controversy actually came up in the 1880s under John Taylor, where somebody wrote a letter to John Taylor asking him which method of priesthood ordination was, can I just be, is ordaining someone to just the office, or do they have to say I confer upon you the Melchizedek priesthood? And John Taylor said both methods had been used from the beginning of the church, and that it's not right to, to create disputation over this. and that the important thing was that the worthiness and the intent of, and Joseph F. Smith actually said the same thing when he talked about this issue in the early 1900s, was that, the biggest thing was worthiness and intent rather than the specific wording use of an ordination. But that Joseph F. Smith liked the I confer upon you the priesthood and I set you apart the office, because he felt it more clearly explains the priesthood theology of, the offices are kind of appendages to the priesthood, is kind of what Joseph F. Smith was liked about that method. You got
Yeah,
something to say on it?
yeah, just on this. Hopefully, sometime this year, myself and Jennifer Roach will be discussing like LDS sacramental theology, and we'll be discussing this particular topic, like what words have to be said and are optional in like the conferral of an ordinance or sacrament. But like Jonathan Stapley, his book on oh, I forget the name of it, but he has a book that was published by Oxford University Press, Mystery of Godliness, I think it's called, where he discusses like the changes in wording of various temple and priesthood ordinances as well. So
Yeah, and his recent article that got into the wording of the sacrament prayer. I thought that was fascinating, learning some of that history. But so we're fundamentalists think that Heber J. Grant really messed up the church's priesthood by setting the wording to, and so Heber J. Grant's logic was, well, if saying it the simpler way does the same thing, why shouldn't we just use the simpler wording of, ordaining to the office, rather than saying I confer upon you the priesthood and set you apart the office. And so fundamentalists really felt that jeopardized the church's priesthood to some degree, and that was almost like a wedge issue they would use to try to get people to entertain fundamentalist priesthood claims because of this issue. I think it was under George Albert Smith that the church actually went back to the previous method of generally just saying, I confer upon you the priesthood and I set you apart to the office. Just because I personally prefer that wording, but I don't, I agree with John Taylor and Joseph F. Smith that didn't really matter. Both methods had been used and were valid methods, but fundamentalists use this as a wedge issue. And Lauren Woolley actually put words into John Taylor's mouth in kind of his history of claiming different things that John Taylor said to him. He tried to put this issue into John Taylor's mouth that he wouldn't, a certain number of men in the church would think they hold the priesthood, but wouldn't have it properly conferred upon them, is what he tried to allege that John Taylor said. But he apparently wasn't aware of the letter that existed by John Taylor saying that there wasn't a proper method and that both methods had been used and were valid. So that's one aspect of the Lauren Woolley story that I don't find to be historically credible, and we'll definitely get into some of the other aspects as well. So, kind of getting into plural marriage as probably the biggest issue in fundamentalism. You mentioned you mentioned on the list of topics that you wanted to discuss that the issue of plural marriage was, and whether it was something required for exaltation or not was one of those issues. So I think that what was taught in so fundamentalists simplify it I do think in this regard they may slightly cherry pick if they want to cite, say, Brigham Young saying the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, who are those who enter into polygamy, when there are actually other statements by Brigham Young saying that faithful monogamists could be exalted. And so what I understand from Brigham Young's teachings and from what was understood by the other Latter-day Saints about eternal marriage and plural marriage in early Utah was that faithful monogamists could be exalted, but they believed that the faithful polygamists would have a higher exaltation, is what many of the early Latter-day Saints said. And so fundamentalists, are slightly right on this issue, slightly wrong on this issue, in my opinion, if they're trying to be true to historically what Brigham Young, John Taylor, and others taught. And so there's a Brigham Young quote on this where he said, men and women will be, and this is in the Salt Lake School of the Prophets. I think you've read that book that was published by Signature Books.
It's an excellent book. Yeah. By the way, shout out to Devery Anderson. He did a great job transcribing that. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The Salt Lake School of the Prophets Minute is a fascinating read where this issue of whether monogamists could be exalted or not actually comes up repeatedly in those minutes. And at one point, kind of William Clayton, something reportedly said by William Clayton saying that that only polygamists would be gods was brought up in three different apostles in that meeting. Brigham Young wasn't present, but I believe Orson Pratt, Joseph F. Smith, and I think one other apostle all kind of said that they did not agree with the sentiments if they, they didn't know if they accurately represented what Clayton said because Clayton wasn't there, but they said they didn't agree with those sentiments. And so on another occasion, when it was brought up in the Salt Lake School of the Prophets, Brigham Young said, "Men and women will be saved in the celestial kingdom without even being married at all, others with only one wife, and some again with many wives. Whoever continues faithful to the end will have all the exaltation they can possibly enjoy. Let every person so live to enjoy the Holy Ghost and please God our Father." He said, the revelation, I think he's referencing D&C 132, though it is the greatest ever given to man, more than that will yet be given when we are ready to receive it. So there's a number of other statements about that faithful monogamists could go to the celestial kingdom. Parley P. Pratt in 1845 said, thus the gradation will descend in regular degrees from the throne of the Ancient of Days with its innumerable subjects down to the least and last saint of the last days, who may be counted worthy of a throne and a scepter, although his kingdom may perhaps only consist of a wife and a single child. And so the question is, why would a polygamist have a greater exaltation? I think this goes into a statement that Joseph Smith made. Let me try actually share. Let's see, that's the wrong. I'm going to share my screen. Interview with Robert Boylan. So Joseph in the King Follett Discourse made, and so I made a number of graphics with quotes that Joseph Smith taught on different subjects. And so Joseph during the King Follett Discourse said this, and it was recorded in his journal kept by Willard Richards. He said, "To know God, learn to become gods. God is exalted by the addition of subjects to his family or kingdom." And so the idea was that an exaltation, while salvation is based on, repentance, faith in Jesus Christ, baptism, and receiving the Holy Ghost and remaining faithful to the end. Exaltation, in contrast, was a doctrine where it was more about your personal works. Was that it's about establishing more of a family kingdom, was what exaltation was explained in early Utah. And so this statement by Joseph Smith is kind of one of the foundational statements for this. There's a statement by Ben Jeff Johnson recalling that Joseph taught our power and glory in the great dominion would be commensurated with the number of wives, children, and friends we inherit here on this earth. And so, I do think that was the context. And of course, that isn't to say, Brigham Young and the other brethren would say, what about those who don't have the opportunity? They said that, and they often made comments saying that God wouldn't, punish someone who didn't receive a family based off of their circumstances they were in, and that and Brigham would actually mention regarding the issue of some people not even having children, because part of this is about having a family, and so some people can't have children. And Brigham said that don't worry, that you can also have children through adoption, and you can also have children. He said the time will come where you will have billions of spirits as your children, is what Brigham Young said in regards to people who were in those kinds of situations. So did that share okay? Did you see that on your screen?
I already see your folder. You may have to share the picture itself.
Oh, let's see. I forget the Zoom's kind of. There we go.
Zoom can be a bit weird, but yeah.
There we go. That's the quote. Okay, I'm glad I asked you that, and so just kind of assuming that you saw the quote. So yeah, this was really emphasized in early Utah as the reason for plural marriage, and so some people ask, why was plural marriage required? And there's different speculative reasons for that. I would say that part of the reason is that God has a massive family with us, and that part of the trials to learn how to deal with the difficulties and hardships that that gods have to deal with would be through having a larger family. And I think that was probably some of the logic for it. And so when it comes to apologists versus fundamentalists, apologists really want to, who are kind of defending the church, will really emphasize the priesthood issues and authority claims as being the thing that they really probably emphasize more than, say, the early Utah theology, while fundamentalists defending their claims will emphasize more the theology over the priesthood issues, is at least in my experience I've seen. And I do think that I think Brian Hales does a really remarkable job defending the church's position on a lot of things in regards to on fundamentalist authority issues. I think that he really took what Max Anderson had done a lot of work on Lauren Woolley, and Brian Hales really kind of carries that work for, he's kind of almost the spiritual successor to Max Anderson, and kind of responding to fundamentalism as an apologist for the church. But I do think that Brian Hales does have some weak spots in his arguments, and as a fundamentalist myself, I'm going to poke back on a couple of things that he said about plural marriage. So that's one of the things. One of the things he says is that he doesn't think that it's often referenced as a law, when I think it's mostly called a principle, a commandment. He doesn't think that it was often called a law. And I actually, from my studying of early Utah Mormonism, they definitely generally, and a lot of times, referred to plural marriage as a law and as a higher law. For example, Wilford Woodruff said on October 9th, 1875, "We have many bishops and elders who have but one wife. They're abundantly qualified to enter the higher law and take more, but their wives will not let them. Any man who will permit a woman to lead him and bind him down is of but little account in the church and kingdom of God. The law of patriarchal marriage and plurality of wives is a revelation and commandment of God to us, and we should obey it. But says one, if you do, Judge McKean will be after you. What has given us a future in these valleys of the mountains is because we've obeyed this part of the celestial law of God." George Q. Cannon, in referencing plural marriage, he says, "But says one, is not this a trial, and does it not inflict upon us unnecessary trials?" He said, and so Cannon answers, and this was on October 9th, 1869, "There are afflictions and trials connected with this principle. It is necessary there should be. Is there any law that God reveals unintended with a trial of some kind? Think of the time you who are adults and were born in nations when you joined the church. Think of the trials connected with your espousal of the gospel. Did it not try you to go forth and be baptized? Did it not try you when called upon to gather, to leave your homes and nearest and dearest friends, as many of you have done? Did it not try you to do a great many things that you've been required to do in the gospel? Every law of the gospel has a trial connected with it, and the higher the law, the greater the trial. And as we ascend nearer and nearer to the Lord our God, we shall have greater trials to contend with in purifying ourselves before him." And so another issue I will kind of critique Brian Hales on theologically. So I think his Joseph Smith polygamy book series are really great, but I do have some disagreements with him on the part 3 on the theology. So one of the issues I'll point out is that in early Utah they often used celestial marriage as a reference for plural marriage, like it was interchangeable terms. And it wasn't until really the 1880s that you start to occasionally see people use it as a reference for monogamous marriage, but it was still mostly used to reference plural marriage. And so Lorenzo Snow, for example, said on January 16th, 1886, "Though I go to prison, God will not change his law of celestial marriage." And after the church issued the manifesto, they issued a petition for amnesty to the U.S. government, trying to ask for church leaders, since they issued the manifesto, to receive kind of clemency, to not to not be prosecuted anymore for plural marriage, because a lot of church leaders had gone into hiding to avoid plural marriage. So this was in 1891. And it's actually Yeah, it was in 1891, the petition for amnesty by the First Presidency. And they said, we formally taught to our people that polygamy or celestial marriage, as commanded by God through Joseph Smith, was right, that was a necessity to man's highest exaltation in the life to come. So those are two different quotes that kind of show that. And so another issue that, and this is something that both, I think that Alma Allred did great in his interview with you, and I thought that Craig Foster and Brian Hills did great in their interviews. One disagreement I'll have is on D&C 132, verse 4. There's kind of a question of whether the law being revealed is a reference to eternal marriage or plural marriage when it's talking about, when it's introducing the section and in section 132. And so let me just read the verse before I read kind of the commentary. So D&C 132, verse 4. For behold, I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant. And if you abide not in that covenant, then you are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. And verse 5 says, for all who will have a blessing at my hand shall abide the law which was appointed for that blessing and the conditions thereof, so as were instituted from before the foundation of the world. So there's a disagreement about whether that's referencing plural marriage or not. And I've collected a number of statements on this issue. I think probably the most authoritative one that I would cite to defend the fundamentalist position is a First Presidency epistle of John, issued by John Taylor and George Q. Cannon on October 6, 1885. And this was published in the Messages of the First Presidency book series. And so this epistle says this: upwards of 40 years ago, the Lord revealed to his church the principle of celestial marriage. The idea of marrying more wives than one was as naturally abhorrent to the leading men and women of the church at that day as it could be to any people. They shrank with dread from the bare thought of entering into such relationships. But the command of God was before them in language which no faithful soul dare obey. For behold, I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant, and if you abide not that covenant, then you are damned, for no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. And as pertaining to the new and everlasting covenant, it was instituted for the fullness of my glory, and he that receiveth the fullness thereof must and shall abide the law, or shall be damned, saith the Lord God. And so the epistle's quoting verses 4 and verse 6. And so it's so then the First Presidency continues. Damnation was the awful penalty affixed to a refusal to obey this law. It became an acknowledged doctrine of the church. It was indissolubly interwoven into the minds of its members with their hopes of eternal salvation and exaltation in the presence of God. And so this was a major issue during the 1880s under John Taylor, was there was starting to get extreme, tough federal prosecution and persecution of plural marriage and Latter-day Saints for continuing to do plural marriage. And during that time, the church leaders just really strongly emphasized that, that they felt that this was an eternal law that was necessary for exaltation, is what the church leaders mentioned at that time. And so there were 4 different revelations. And if you talk to any fundamentalists, you'll hear about these 4 revelations that were given during the 1880s that touch on the subject of plural marriage. There's the 1880 revelation to Wilford Woodruff. It was in the wilderness, I believe is called the Wilderness Revelation. And that said, woe unto the people that seek to hinder my people from obeying the patriarchal law of Abraham. And they felt the context of that revelation was the Lord displeased with the U.S. government for persecuting the Latter-day Saints for plural marriage. Then there was the October 1882 revelation on plural marriage, where this is actually the revelation calling Heber J. Grant to the apostleship, interestingly enough. But in this 1882 revelation, the key phrase that the apostles and church leaders at that time thought was significant was, it is not meet that a man who will not abide my law should preside over my priesthood. And they felt that these men who were being called to presiding positions in the church needed to enter into plural marriage to be worthy of the presiding positions in the church. And so John Taylor at the October, 2 years later at the October 1884 conference, kind of talked about this revelation again. They repeatedly talked about it during the 1880s. He said, we have been told it is not meet that men who will not abide my law shall preside over my priesthood. And yet some people would like very much to do it. Well, they cannot do it. If God has introduced something for our glory and exaltation, we are not going to have that kicked over by any improper influence, either inside or outside of the church of the living God. We will stand by the principles of eternal truth. Living, we will proclaim them, and dying, we will be true to them. And after death, we will live again in their enjoyment in the eternal worlds. And so this revelation wasn't just given through John Taylor, but it was actually brought to it was ratified by the Conference of the Church, and it was even actually included in several foreign editions of the Doctrine and Covenants. And it goes into a lot of other stuff too, but this was the church leaders at the time really emphasized its emphasis on plural marriage. So I guess Wilford Woodruff actually wrote in his journal right after it was received that John Taylor said, and this is October 14th, 1882, if we do not embrace that principle soon, the keys will be turned against us. For if we do not keep the same law that our Heavenly Father has, we cannot go with him. The word of the Lord to us was, if we do not obey that law, we cannot go where our Heavenly Father dwells. A man obeying a lower law is not qualified to preside over those who keep a higher law. And so this was the second of the four hidden revelations. The third one is probably the most commonly known as the 1886 revelation to John Taylor, which that one was not actually discovered until after John Taylor's death, according to the words of his son, John W. Taylor. And he used it as an argument why plural marriage should keep continuing, even kind of arguing that should be used that plural marriage should continue independent of the church, is what John W. Taylor said. And he was very much a proto-fundamentalist in that his ideas were some of the foundation that would lead to the growth of the fundamentalist movement. But yeah, the 1886 revelation is considered important, not just because of the words of that revelation, but because of the events that Warren Woolley would say occurred in connection with this revelation. I don't think I don't think those events are all historical, and that's definitely we'll talk about when we get into the priesthood side of them. But the revelation is accepted by historians generally as being authentic, and so just kind of to read the text of it real quick, or at least because it isn't the longest revelation in the world. It just says, thus, my son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants can't be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on the subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and keeping of my commandments, and yet I have borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times, and furthermore, it is more pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded that men, if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting. And those who will enter in my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, amen. So that's a revelation that Apostle John W. Taylor really emphasized. He said in a meeting of the apostles right after the manifesto on September 30th, 1890, my father, when president of the church, sought to find a way to evade the conflict between the saints and government on the question of plural marriage, but the Lord said it was an eternal and unchangeable law and must stand. Then 2 years later, on April 1st of 1892, he said, I do not know that the manifesto was right, though I voted to sustain it and will assist to maintain it. But among my father's papers, I found a revelation given him of the Lord, which is now in my possession, which the Lord told him the principle of plural marriage would never be overcome. President John Taylor desired to have it suspended, but the Lord would not permit it to be done. So that's the 1886 revelation. Then the last of the four hidden revelations is the 1889 revelation that Wilford Woodruff received. And this was in November of 1889. And Abraham Cannon actually kind of wrote about having the revelation read in a meeting of the apostles on December 19th, 1889. He wrote, "During our meeting, a revelation was read which President Woodruff received Sunday evening, November 24th, 1889. Propositions had been made for the church to make some concessions to the courts in regards to its principles. Both of President Woodruff's counselors refused to advise him as to the course he should pursue, and there he laid the matter before the Lord. The answer came quick and strong. The word of the Lord was for us not to yield one particular of that which he had revealed and established." And so this revelation basically said, let your counselors continue to make their pleadings before the courts guided by the Holy Spirit, but make no further pledges of the priesthood to the government. And so they interpreted that as to not make any more political concessions to the government regarding plural marriage. And so those four revelations are important to understand the doctrinal context for fundamentalist belief about the necessity of continuing plural marriage. Do you have any questions or thoughts about any of those revelations or about the context of that?
No, I think that's pretty good. And for what it's worth, I would agree the 1886 revelation is authentic. The real issue is like how to interpret it, but yeah, it's authentic. What topic do you want to move on to next? Or do you want to discuss like maybe post-manifesto and like the view of Wilford Woodruff among some fundamentalists?
Yeah, so I guess that's only telling you part of the story of why fundamentalists feel that plural marriage needed to continue. Because the other half of the story is that the Wilford Woodruff, so the church is fighting the I think it's the Edmunds-Tucker Act in the late 1880s, which has dissolved the LDS Church as a corporation. And I think they'd also banned Mormons immigrating to the United States, I believe, around, in connection with that. And, they were basically threatening to take all the church's property. And the threat was of all the temples being confiscated by the US government. And so the saints were hoping that by taking plural marriage as an issue to the Supreme Court, that they could get a Supreme Court ruling in their favor, defending it as being a constitutionally protected aspect of their religious beliefs. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And after it went to the Supreme Court, Wilford Woodruff felt impressed. And he wrote in his journal, I think, about it, that he felt the Spirit of the Lord, or the Lord showed him what he should do. He felt impressed to issue the manifesto of 1890, basically giving advice and counsel to the saints to no longer, to obey the laws of the land and to no longer enter into any marriages contrary to the laws of the land. Up to that time, the policy had generally been, we will obey God over man, but they felt that the threat of having the temples taken and work for the dead ceased would be enough for, to warrant the saints to comply in this one regard, so that they could continue to carry on these other functions of the gospel that they also felt were important. Like Wilford Woodruff was like, the temples are important, work for the dead's important, not just, not plural marriage is just one aspect of what we're trying to do. And so that was the logic behind the manifesto. But where the history is fuzzy is how the manifesto was to be understood by the Latter-day Saints. So many Latter-day Saints did not think that it actually was a revelation suspending plural marriage. They felt that it was a political concession to the government to get the government off their back, and that it wasn't actually a revelation to end plural marriage. And you can kind of see the church leaders during the 1890s actually discuss this during their church meetings, and that they actually felt that that plural marriage would actually, that maybe once they got statehood, if they complied enough with the government, and maybe when they got statehood, then they would be able to continue plural marriage. So one discussion about that was very interesting about this was a discussion of church leaders. Let me see if I can find this exact statement in 1892. But there was several apostles who actually let me see. Might have been in 1891 if I can't find it real quick. I try to have the quotes right off the top of my head, but sometimes um, there's another discussion in April. So okay, August 20th, 1891. It's a discussion about the meaning and intent of the manifesto. And so I found this very interesting. It can be found in the minutes of meetings of the Quorum of the 12. So in this discussion, they said, Brother Heber J. Grant, having had a previous conversation with President Joseph F. Smith, asked him if he was now satisfied with regard to the manifesto being a revelation from God. President Joseph F. Smith answered emphatically no. He then went on to explain how he did regard the manifesto. He believed that President Woodruff was inspired to write the manifesto in consequence of the situation we were placed in, and that because of the circumstances in which we were placed before the government, the Lord sanctioned it. But he did not believe it to be an empathetic revelation from God abolishing plural marriage. President George Buchanan referred to the remarks of President Smith and said he regarded President Smith's understanding on this matter to be his also, that he himself did not regard the manifesto as a revelation abolishing polygamy. For that reason, it was an eternal principle and could not be abolished by anyone, but in believing that President Woodruff was inspired to write the manifesto, he also believed it to be a revelation from God for the reason that revelation, as he conceived it to be, was a communication of God's will to man, irrespective of the form it may be written. President Cannon's view was fully endorsed by Brother Lorenzo Snow and the Council of the 12 generally. President Woodruff expressed himself in this connection, said he foresaw what was coming upon us, that our temples were in danger, the work for the dead liable to be stopped, and he believed he would have lived to witness the hand of the government extended to crush us. But the Lord did not intend that Zion should be crushed, and he averted the blow by inspiring me to write and issue the manifesto, and certainly has had the effect of doing it so far. How long it, i.e. the manifesto, may remain in force is not for me to say, but that is for God alone to say. As for the principle, i.e. plural marriage, it is eternal and will stand forever. So that is an interesting discussion of church leaders that was recorded in the minutes of the church of the Quorum of the 12. And Apostle Mariner Merrill, who was there for that meeting, wrote in his diary, I do not believe the manifesto was a revelation from God, but was formulated by President Woodruff and endorsed by his counselors and the 12 apostles for the expediency to meet the present situation of affairs in the nation or those against the church. So in that context, they viewed it as an inspired document to meet their present conditions rather than empathetic revelation abolishing plural marriage. So it was based, and so after this, the church leaders really started to have plural marriages continue mostly in like Mexico, and they tried to do some up in Canada. They felt that maybe if we do it outside of the United States, then will avoid us getting in trouble for it. But the church, leaders and members continued to be doing plural marriage privately, but a lot of this information eventually came out in I think it's 1903 or 19. The Reed Smoot hearings were in 1903, right?
1904.
No, they were in 1904. Okay, I knew the second manifesto was in 1904. I didn't know if the hearings were in 1903 or 1904. But basically, they were, after Utah was granted statehood, in 1896, right? Is when I'm just going off at the top of my head right here. Utah could finally have political representation in Congress, and so they hoped to have Latter-day Saints involved with the U.S. government and kind of having a positive influence in that. And so, church apostle Reed Smoot was, I don't know if he was already apostle by that time. He may have already been an apostle. He was apostle. He was called as an apostle in 1900. Okay, so he was already an apostle, and so he was elected to be one of the senators for Utah. But the U.S. Congress did not want to, or Senate did not want to seat him in the Senate because they did not think the Latter-day Saints were sincere in giving up plural marriage. And so the Reed Smoot hearings were held as a kind of a political crusade against the church, and just they really grilled all the church leaders they could over all the issues they could, particularly over plural marriage. And that just really brought embarrassment on the church, where there was thousands of pages of testimony in those hearings. And after that, that's when the second manifesto was issued by Joseph F. Smith in, I believe, at the April 1894, 1904, gotta catch myself there, General Conference. And this one basically reaffirmed the manifesto and basically said that those who continued to enter into plural marriage were liable to be excommunicated from the church for it. And so this was the manifesto, but with more teeth in it. And so then this is where the history kind of gets a little bit fuzzy about, and this is where fundamentalism, the proto-fundamentalism, kind of starts to really begin. Is there were some apostles after the Second Manifesto who continued to be involved with plural marriage even after it. One of them apparently said regarding the Second Manifesto that they didn't believe it was any more binding than the First Manifesto, is what one of the apostles who was continuing plural marriage felt about that Second Manifesto. And so there starts to be kind of a split among the apostles in the quorum over whether plural marriage should continue or not. And some of the guys who were pretty gung-ho about plural marriage, I think Abraham Woodruff and Mariner Merrill, I keep pronouncing his name wrong, Mariner Merrill, there we go. They died shortly after the Second Manifesto, or around that time, and their replacements that were called weren't involved with all the 1890s continuing plural marriage stuff, and so they very much were against any new plural marriages. And so it basically got to the point that there were only two guys in the quorum that were really trying to keep doing this, were Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor. And the debate among historians is John W. Taylor tried to say that Joseph F. Smith was secretly okay with him keep doing plural marriage. And the Quorum of the 12 thought that was a ridiculous assertion. And so that's the split between the church and really kind of the proto-fundamentalists, is whether they felt that, whether Joseph F. Smith really was sincere in being against plural marriage or not. Because during the 1890s, church leaders would make statements publicly against it, but privately would say, you could keep, it can continue under, private circumstances. And so the question was Joseph F. Smith secretly continuing kind of that, that double policy, the private policy being okay with it, public policy being against it. And, different historians have different perspectives on that. I think Brian Hales has written a little bit about that in some of his history on fundamentalism, where he kind of thinks that the only plural marriages that were approved of by Joseph F. Smith after 1904 were ones that the approval had been given prior to the Second Manifesto. And so he felt it was kind of a retroactive exception because they had been given the authorization before the Second Manifesto was issued. D. Michael Quinn felt that Joseph F. Smith was okay with continuing plural marriage up until, probably, into the 1910s, is kind of what Quinn's personal perspective on it. So this is a debated subject among historians, and fundamentalists lean more towards thinking that Joseph F. Smith was secretly okay with continuing plural marriage, and that's kind of how they view. And so they really ask the question, if the First Manifesto didn't end plural marriage, did the Second Manifesto end plural marriage? And some of them would argue that, does the Second Manifesto, which is a political statement in response to the government, does that really decide what laws of God we're allowed to keep or not, is the fundamentalist perspective on the Second Manifesto. And part of the issue that makes this kind of a fuzzy issue is the sealing authority issue in Mormonism, where historically the doctrine taught under Joseph Smith and Nauvoo and by Brigham Young was that there was only one man who held the keys to authorize plural marriages to be, that's taken from D&C 132.7. And what John W. Taylor's perspective on on things was that in the 1880s, after the severe political situation that the church was put in, that they kind of felt that plural merit, that the one man, as it was termed, the key holder, was no longer needed to be directly involved with plural marriages being performed. And so one of the statements on this comes from John W. Taylor, where he said he interpreted the 1886 revelation, to mean that the man who stood at the head was relieved of the responsibility of holding the keys, and free agency was given to all my people. And really, that's an interpretation of the 1886 revelation that John W. Taylor had. But I've kind of written about this in one of my issues of One Eternal Round. I think it was in issue number 7 on the one anointed and appointed in early Utah, that this idea that the prophet was now no longer directly involved with approving plural marriage was something that you see in John Taylor's other statements during the 1880s, where he was actually brought and subpoenaed to appear in a trial regarding a polygamist, and he was kind of asked about whether he was personally involved with approving plural marriages to be done or not. And he made the statement that there were hundreds who had been given dispensations to perform it under specific circumstances. And he said that he or Joseph F. Smith or George Buchanan, as the members of the First Presidency, were the ones who could give that kind of dispensation. And I think the argument is credible that Wilford Woodruff basically uninvolved himself as president of the Church of approving plural marriages as well, that he had George Buchanan and Joseph F. Smith be the guys who kind of set men and give approval, etc., for doing plural marriages. And that seems to have been the policy going down to Joseph F. Smith. And the fundamentalist question on this doctrinal issue is whether that continued to be legitimate under Joseph F. Smith or not. And so there started to be men popping up in the early 1900s under Joseph F. Smith, who were ordained to the office of patriarchs in the church. And they started to be performing plural marriages. And there seemed to be this issue of stake patriarchs performing plural marriages. About 1909 to 1911 is when that started. And what's very fascinating about this is that, that John W. Taylor reportedly ordained, he made statements about or giving patriarchs authority to perform plural marriages. And he actually made a statement in a general conference in 1900 that he believed that from his reading of D&C 124 about the Hiram Smith as patriarch holding the sealing power, that he felt that every patriarch equally could utilize the sealing power, was what John W. Taylor's belief was. And so John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley get dropped from the Quorum of the 12. I believe that was in 1906, going off of memory, but they weren't excommunicated or disciplined until 5 years later in 1911. That's when they did the trials of John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, where it was between it was about 1909 to 1911, where there started to be men popping up claiming to have authority to do plural marriages, and Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor seemed to be linked to that. And so the Quorum of the 12 started to kind of go on a hunt to try to start enforcing the Second Manifesto and to start excommunicating individuals that they believed were in violation of the Second Manifesto. And so those individuals, got excommunicated. A lot of them would be major figures in the early fundamentalist movement, like John Woolley, Joseph Musser. Some of those big names in the early fundamentalist movement were the men that were kind of excommunicated in those 1910s disciplinary trials. And so in 1911, John W. Taylor had a trial, and he was cut off from the church, and he was excommunicated for. It wasn't just over plural marriage, but they felt he had a he was out of union with his quorum and had a very bitter spirit towards the Quorum of the 12 in that meeting. And so those were some of the factors for his excommunication. Matthias Cowley in that same month, but Matthias Cowley had more of a repentant spirit to him, where he tried to act in harmony, and so he was actually excommunicated. He was just disfellowshipped and was censored from exercising priesthood authority in the church. So one thing that's interesting with Cowley and with John W. Taylor is that John W. Taylor really stressed using the 1886 revelation as his justification to continue plural marriage no matter what. And the men who were being set apart, ordained in the early 1900s to do plural marriages. Often there were comments made that they felt that they had authority to continue it no matter what. And in contrast, Matthias Cowley emphasized the 1882 revelation of John Taylor, where it said the man is not meet for men to preside over my priesthood who will not abide my law, was Matthias Cowley's perspective. And so anyhow, those became minority views by the 1910s. And, and they were the people who were involved with them and trying to perform plural marriages after the Second Manifesto got excommunicated, and a lot of them did end up affiliating with the proto-fundamentalist movement in the 1910s and 1920s. And Samuel Taylor's book, I don't know if you've seen the book Family Kingdom about John W. Taylor. Have you heard of that book or read that book?
Name sounds familiar, but I don't think I've read it.
So Samuel Taylor was John W. Taylor's son, and he has some fascinating historical details about his father in that book. And in the book, he kind of mentions that his father was doing kind of these cottage meetings, like in his house, where they were having the different people who were still sympathetic to plural marriage get together and do these kind of meetings. And it's kind of interesting that he was doing those, because that's what the early fundamentalists during the 1920s started to do as well. But he also, this is kind of interesting from John W. Taylor's perspective, is in the book, Samuel Taylor also recalls that John W. Taylor was approached by one of the early fundamentalists in the 1910s and asked, would you step forward and lead our movement and reorganize kind of basically wanting to start a new church with John W. Taylor as the head of the new church. And John W. Taylor actually took an extremely negative view to that proposition. He said the LDS church is the one true church. The Lord's there's only one church, and I'm loyal to it and its leaders. And even though I still believe in plural marriage and in all these principles, I'm not going to fight against the Lord's church, is what John W. Taylor said. And so he declined, leading that movement, and he actually passed away on October 10th, 1916. So he wouldn't have lived long enough to really be a long-term leader of that movement anyway. So I guess that's kind of getting into some of the polygamy issues, kind of getting that historical context for why fundamentalists believe plural marriage is important. I'm not going to go into as much detail about some of these other doctrines, but united order was an important thing to fundamentalists because, kind of looking back to Brigham Young and John Taylor, that in early Utah, Brigham Young, I think, late 1860s, early 1870s, really started to emphasize the saints trying to do united orders again, which were, started in the 1830s under Joseph Smith. I don't think they were actually called united orders at those times. There was law of consecration first, then the united firm, I think, was what was called during the late Kirtland period. But during Nauvoo, Joseph Smith didn't actually try to really establish any united orders there during the Nauvoo period. He actually said, we can't do the law of consecration here, or it would become a total abortion, is what he said. So he felt it would just blow up, is what he felt about doing it. But Brigham Young, by the 1860s and 1870s, felt that he had revelation that the saints needed to step forward and to do this aspect of the celestial law, which is consecration, and or at least he felt that the United Order was a stepping stone to the law of consecration, where it was almost like joint cooperative, you know, joint venture cooperation between church members. And he really stressed this as an important thing for Utah to try to limit the outside influence, the world's influence on Utah. He really emphasized the need for the saints to enter into the United Order. I actually think there's actually a revelation or two that he dictated where he said that the church needed to have the United Order in order to progress. And I'm not entirely sure about the details of when United Order stopped. I just remember I think Orderville was this was basically broken up in the late 1880s or the early 1890s, I think. And I believe I remember a statement in the 1890s where church leaders made a comment that they felt that they couldn't do United Orders because of issues with complying with the law of the land and legal regulations is what they said was the reasoning why they stopped doing United Orders. But fundamentalists really pitched their tent on these two principles as plural marriage and United Order, and to the point they actually um, have you looked into any of the fabricated quotes that fundamentalists use? Like Eldon Watson has talked about some unreliable quotes.
I've seen some here and there.
Yeah, so occasionally there's some spurious quotes shared in fundamentalism, and I try to be, you know, honest in history and pointing them out when I see others share them. And so, like, there's one that is allegedly in the diary of Charles Walker saying that Brigham Young would be the one that he prophesied that Joseph Smith in 1832 prophesied that Brigham Young would be the president of the church and would be the one to reveal the identity of God to the people. But that's not what the journal entry says. The journal entry said that he remembered that the person who was telling the story remembered that Joseph predicted that Brigham would be the leader of the church and would be one of the greatest individuals to preach redemption to the world. So not as exciting as the claim that Brigham Young would be the one to reveal the identity of God to the world. So that was a spurious fake quote. But another one that's spurious, and Eldon Watson points this out as a spurious Brigham Young quote, is where allegedly Brigham Young said, "Hear ye, Latter-day Saints, the fullness of the gospel is plural marriage in the United Order," is one of those spurious quotes. And Eldon Watson, in his review of Complete Discourse of Brigham Young, actually strongly criticizes them for including that quote and another quote about how the church would be led to the brinks of hell by the leaders of the people, and then the one mighty and strong would come and set the church in order, is what that second quote. And so that those two quotes somehow they're quoted in Complete Discourse of Brigham Young, but not by any reliable source. It's saying these quotes are coming from Truth Magazine and issues in the 1930s. So, 50, 60 years after Brigham Young's death, the schismatic fundamentalist movement is making these statements alleging that Brigham said these things. And so that's that Eldon Watson correctly said that those are not reliable statements. And the one about the one mighty, the church will be led to the brink of hell, and the one mighty and strong would redeem the church, actually comes from, I think it was Nathaniel Baldwin, if I'm not mistaken, who's claiming to be the one mighty and strong. And so, not least reliable source in the world is a random schismatic guy claiming to be the one mighty and strong, alleging that he remembered that Brigham Young said the one mighty and strong would be sent to redeem the church. So, but yeah, fundamentalists really, they had a lot of folk tradition, and so they really, they had some spurious quotes that ended up mixed into their beliefs. So another doctrine that you and I have both done a lot of research on, that fundamentalists were really big on, is the Adam God doctrine, that was part of Brigham Young's cosmology from 1852, and he, up to his death in 1877, and was believed by various leaders during the late Utah period. So many, if not most, fundamentalists are big on the out of God doctrine because they felt that that was a revealed teaching through Brigham Young. Then the fourth one is that doctrine that most fundamentalists agree on is this idea that priesthood and salvation can exist outside of the church. And as a historian, I'm interested in ideas like this and how historical they are and how they fit with Mormonism. I know Brian Hales has written and compiled quotes to kind of argue that if you're cut off from the church, you lose your priesthood. And I know there are a lot of statements like that, but there are statements, they're not as numerous, but there are occasionally statements that would support kind of the fundamentalist position that you can, lose your standing and still to some degree be saved. For example, this is one example that I would use. So in William Clayton's diary on October 19th, 1843, he recalled that Joseph Smith told him that if his plural marriage was found out and people created trouble over it, he said, quote, "If they raise trouble about it and bring you before me, I will give you an awful scourging and probably cut you off from the church, and then I will baptize you and set you ahead as good as ever." So, kind of an interesting idea that you could be cut off and you would still be, okay, not a genuine excommunication. Joseph is saying that wouldn't hurt him because he would just rebaptize him and set him ahead as good as ever. And there's arguments that that Joseph F. Smith held some degree of sympathy to some of the men who were excommunicated during the 1910s over plural marriage, such as John W. Taylor. There's the family preserved tradition that that Joseph F. Smith actually brought temple robes for him the night he was dead. He died so that he could be buried in temple robes, which would indicate a belief that he felt that John W. Taylor may have had temple blessings or priesthood to some degree in spite of being excommunicated. There's another interesting account, and this is in Fundamentalist, so it's not as reliable, but in Fundamentalist history, they allege that there was a private, discussion between Joseph F. Smith and John Woolley. This was John Woolley's granddaughter alleged that he heard her say that, well, she heard a conversation between them after a state conference where Joseph F. Smith said he regretted his excommunication and wished it wasn't done and could have, but it was out of his hand. And he said, "But we can bring you back into the church privately." And she said that her grandfather, John Woolley, said, "I was cut off publicly, so I would need to be reinstated publicly." And she said that they weren't able to reinstate him over that issue. On the issue of priesthood outside of the church, that's a fascinating issue, and it kind of gets into what's true and what's mythology on what fundamentalists believe about priesthood and what Joseph Smith taught about priesthood and forms of authority independent of the church. But one statement that could be used by fundamentalists to defend the idea of priesthood outside of the church is Heber C. Kimball, during the trial of Sidney Rigdon, said, "Elder Rigdon has no authority, only what he receives from the church." And then he goes on to talk about how there were more than 30 men who held higher authority than Sidney Rigdon, referencing men who had received higher temple ordinances. And so he said, Rigdon was not in the council pertaining to the high priesthood until just before he started for Pittsburgh. Brother Phelps was the means of bringing him in, but he has not got the same authority as others. There are more than 30 men who have got higher authority than he has. There are men here, brethren, who have got authority, but we don't want to mention their names, for the enemy will try to kill them. So this is a very common quote that fundamentalists will use to argue for the existence of priesthood independent of the church. So Rigdon, they say he doesn't have any authority, only what he receives from the church. So implying there was authority that was independent of the church is what a fundamentalist would read out of that statement. And so this was a big, this is a big issue for fundamentalists, was trying to defend and argue a belief that priesthood and salvation could exist outside of the traditional church structure. And I do think that this quote has merit in another way, in that one of the common arguments against fundamentalists, and I've heard Bruce R. McConkie use this, I've heard Brian Hales use this, is saying that there will be no secret ordinations, that there cannot be a secret ordination but that would be valid for a priesthood authority. And there are revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that reference the organization of the church, that things should be done by common consent and with the knowledge of the church, etc. But this statement indicates that there was some sort of priesthood authority, that Heber C. Kimball said, there are men who have it, but we don't want to mention their names, for the enemy will try to kill them. So this kind of idea of authority independent of the church and secret authority is something that can kind of be established by the apostles in Nauvoo, because that's where Joseph did give them their their highest keys that they claimed, where they received the fullness of the priesthood and the sealing power. And George A. Smith, in the Journal of Discourses, actually made a statement mentioning that after things fell into apostasy in Moses's dispensation, that the priesthood had to be kept a secret. He said, this is Journal of Discourses, Volume 2, page 212. Moses undertook to give the children of Israel the laws of the priesthood, to make them a holy people, a chosen generation, a kingdom of priests. But what was the result? They would not receive it. We find the same attempt was made in the days of Solomon, the wise king of Israel. He goes on to say, so Solomon tried to build the temples, what he said, so that the ordinance of exaltation to be revealed, but that he said, quote, the keys of the priesthood consequently had to be kept a secret. And years after, the prophets were lamenting, mourning, complaining, and finding fault with the people, because the Lord could never be permitted to reveal the fullness of his will to the children of men. So secret authority seems to have some degree of basis in some of the statements made by the apostles after Joseph Smith's death, and part of their claims to authority. So just to briefly touch, rebaptism was something that was done. It started with Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, and it continued up until in the 1890s. They started to strongly discourage it, but in isolated cases continued up until the early 1900s under Joseph F. Smith. But that was an idea that a person could renew their baptismal covenants at various times throughout their life, to symbolically rededicate themselves to the Lord at significant moments. And so that was something that was really taught a lot in early Utah under Brigham Young. And so that's something that many fundamentalists believe in. They believe in the necessity of the original temple garment, and they partly emphasize that over Joseph F. Smith's making statements during his time as church president, saying that the design should not be altered or changed, as their arguments for, they cite those as supportive statements for it. And then, they're really big on the priesthood ban generally, because that was part of Brigham Young's priesthood teachings that he emphasized to a significant degree. And as we already talked about, the proper method of priesthood conferral. So now that we've kind of, do you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to?
No, that's pretty good. Just kind of a question that came to mind. Because Woodruff issued the 1890 proclamation and so forth. Are there any fundamentalists who believe Wilford Woodruff became a fallen prophet as a result of that? Like how David Wimmer believed Joseph became a fallen prophet in the mid 1830s, or is there's no fundamentalist or fundamentalist group that actually would go that far when it comes to Wilford Woodruff?
So I think it depends on the fundamentalists. There are two different kinds of, so when it comes to the Woolley line of authority, claiming authority came out of the church, coming down to Lord Woolley and passing to the large fundamentalist groups today, the two ideas are that the keys got passed down from Woodruff, continued to hold them, then Lorenzo Snow, then Joseph F. Smith, and then they believe that after Joseph F. Smith, it went to to John Woolley, and it went to the fundamentalists after that, after Joseph F. Smith. And so some think Joseph F. Smith was the last church president to be the highest key holder, is kind of what some believe, while others, and I think there's an argument that this is the more traditional, what Loren Woolley claimed, is that Loren Woolley seemed to teach that in 1886, when he alleged that John Taylor ordained them to keep alive plural marriage as high priests apostles, to, in a council of friends, six, or yeah, I think it was a council of six high priests apostles, it might have been seven. Yeah, there were six men ordained, but then there was a seventh that he said was ordained later, which was Joseph F. Smith. But so his view, that what Loren Woolley seemed to teach and what many fundamentalists believe, is that the presiding keys after John Taylor went to John Woolley as the first man ordained in that secret 1886 meeting. And so they think that Woodruff actually never was the presiding key holder, is what some think. And they think it was actually John Woolley, then Loren Woolley, etc. down the, and so it kind of doesn't even go past what John Taylor to Woodruff and some of the beliefs about some of the fundamentalist beliefs about succession. And let's see, do I have there we go. Okay, cool. So
while you do that, just so I won't forget, I do have my friend Hayden Curl, who you may know. He's really been wanting to ask like one question that maybe you can address now or later. Like, he says, wanted to ask about Loren Woolley's claims haven't really been discussed tonight. How does Jacob reconcile the contradictory contemporary records which disagree with Loren's recollection of the September 27, 1886 events, such as the journals of John Taylor, George Q. Cannon, and Samuel Bateman for that date?
So I think that, yeah, that's a good question. I actually really liked, I think Hayden Carroll did a lot of great work in his presentations on Loren Woolley. So this kind of diagram I'm showing now is a diagram that Brian Hales put together. I think it's one of the best diagrams showing where most of the groups claim their authority. It's not up to date. I think this is several decades old, and so it doesn't really have some of the current leaders of some of the groups, and some of the groups aren't really extant anymore. But I do think it's a good diagram. So, the alleged 1886 ordination. So my view on fundamentalist authority with or Woolleyite authority is, I agree with everything that Brian Hales and Max Anderson have put together, showing there's some serious holes in the theology of there being a council of friends that's a highest priesthood quorum presiding over everything, and there were secret ordinations in 1886. The parts of the 1886 story that I do think are true, that I think shouldn't be downplayed, because I think there's half of the story is historically verifiable, half of it isn't, is I think there was indeed the 1886 revelation. There was indeed concern over what political course of action, whether they should give up plural marriage or not. You see that 2 years later with Wilford Woodruff proposing a manifesto in 1888, and the Quorum of the 12 rejected it when that was made. But so this was an issue on John Taylor's mind. The 1886 revelation is legitimate. The meetings really occurred, but what's interesting about the accounts of the meetings is that none of the accounts mention Loren Woolley being present. They mention like George Q. Cannon, John Woolley being there, a bunch of, some of those guys, but Loren Woolley is not mentioned in any of those journal entries. But there was some sort of meeting that was held that day that you can see from the journals. And I think what is plausible is that John Woolley in the 1910s said that part of the reason he decided to be involved with continuing plural marriage was that John Taylor one morning came out of hiding. So the 1886 meeting allegedly happened in John Woolley's house when John Taylor was in hiding in John Woolley's house. And what John Woolley told Matthias Cowley and told Reuben Miller, which is found in the minutes of the Quorum of the 12 in those 1910 minutes, 1911 minutes, is that John Taylor came out of his room with his face shining one morning. And he said that John Taylor said, this principle will never be overcome. And so I could see there being some sort of legitimacy to the men being told that, that plural marriage needs to continue no matter what, because that was what John Taylor's policy is evident from many statements during the 1880s, as I read many of those statements. But the claim that a council of friends was ordained isn't supported by any early record. The earliest time, Lauren Woolley is the first one to make mention of that in the 1920s. And some people will try to say, well, that's just an argument from silence. But the issue is more than just silence. The issue is that we have tons and tons of records from the men involved, from like George Buchanan writing journal entries over the next following decade or two about details regarding plural marriage. And there were lots of other people keeping records about the details regarding plural marriage being continued. And there's not a word in those, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900 up to 1910 records really that would reference John Woolley or any other of those alleged 6 men who were ordained by John Taylor to keep alive plural marriage no matter what. And so what the records show is that it was the Quorum of the 12 who were the ones keeping alive plural marriage after the 1890 manifesto, and they eventually fell to just John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley being the last 2 who were trying to do that. And then you start seeing these other patriarchs popping up claiming to, or saying that they had authority to do plural marriages. And so what's interesting is I think that John Woolley's real source of his authority actually comes from Joseph F. Not from Joseph F. Smith, but from John W. Taylor, who may have been thinking he was acting under Joseph F. Smith's desires to see plural marriage continue. And so in that journal entry I referenced earlier by Charles W. Penrose on February 22nd, 1911, he wrote, February 22nd arrived, and with it, John W. Taylor. 9 of the 12 were present as Taylor refused to comment on allegations that he continued to perform plural marriages and was taking additional wives on the grounds that he wanted to legally protect himself. However, Taylor complained of church influence in politics, admitted to giving Patriarch Woolley authority to perform plural marriages. And then he goes on to talk about the 1886 revelation and free agency being given to all my people. So what's significant about this diary is it shows, I believe, the real source of John Woolley's authority, and I believe Lauren Woolley's authority, because Lauren Woolley said the keys that John Woolley held were passed on to him after John Woolley, came from John W. Taylor. This is a contemporary entry in Charles W. Penrose's journal on February 22nd, 1911. And the other source, there's a couple other interesting, fascinating sources. There were a lot of other patriarchs that started to pop up saying that they were ordained. Nathan Clark said that he was ordained by an apostle. He actually said that he was ordained by John Woolley and by this is way later recollections from fundamentalist folklore, so take it with whatever degree of salt you choose. But the Nathan Clark was telling people that he was ordained to do plural marriages by Joseph F. Smith in the 1910s, and he said this. And then the other source is Rulon Allred recalled that both Joseph Musser and Nathan Clark were ordained to do plural marriages. And so you start having these guys popping up with plural marriages, and it's unclear how involved Joseph F. Smith was. I think people who take the church's position would say that that's fundamentalist folklore to say that Joseph F. Smith was involved with setting men apart to do plural marriages in the 1910s, and that it's more likely that it was like Matthias Cowley or John W. Taylor, and maybe later on those stories got embellished or exaggerated. But they did feel like they were still in harmony with Joseph F. Smith, because there's a quote by let me see. Can you still see the diagram on my screen of the?
Yes.
So there actually is a statement alleging that this is the earliest account of John Woolley's authority, And I was told that Don Bradley actually was the one to find this account in another Woolley in another Woolley's memoirs written really early. So this is even before Lauren Woolley starts claiming to be ordained an apostle. Um, um, so let me see if I can pull up this statement real quick. Let, let's see. It was Ed D. Woolley. Oh, there we go. Edwin D. Woolley Jr. Reminiscences, March 20th. So this is before this is recorded in March 1920. And it's Edwin D. Woolley Jr. Reminiscences. He wrote, quote, John Woolley told me that within 2 months of President Smith's death, President Smith told him to go ahead in his mission of sealing plural marriages, that nothing could be done to him. And it is on this that he is making his stand. So that's fascinating on this idea that, let me see, how do I get my, there we go. I stopped sharing. Let me start resharing again. It was kind of, there we go. So that entry is fascinating because it's saying that their authority came from Joseph F. Smith rather than John Taylor, as would later be claimed, is what that statement allegedly says. And so I do think that there's if you want to, it's debatable how legal it was. If you want to say that John Woolley was ordained by John W. Taylor and other guys were set apart as patriarchs to do plural marriages by other apostles. But what's significant is they were told to keep, to perform plural marriages, but part of the idea was to not fight against the church and not be against the church. And that's not just what you see in that. You don't just see that with that statement I mentioned from the book Family Kingdom about John W. Taylor saying that he believed in plural marriage, but he wouldn't fight against the church. But you see that in people recalling that John Woolley had that same attitude, that he felt that he didn't have authority to organize, that he was just trying to keep plural marriage going according to what he had been commissioned to do. And so that's kind of how the fundamentalist movement started. You can, whether there were men ordained in 1886 or not is more of a faith position. But the Lauren Woolley story, claiming men were ordained apostles, starts to be told in the 1920s. And then John Woolley dies, I believe in 1928 or 1929. And then after he dies, that's when Lauren Woolley publishes, him and Joseph Musser published the full, and this is considered to fundamentalists, the most authoritative version of the Lauren Woolley story, claiming, all the 1886 events that fundamentalists allege happened, that it was not just a revelation, but that Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith appeared. I do think that there's statements saying that Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith did appear to John Taylor while he was in exile, but those statements actually appear before September 1886. So I don't think, I'm not sure if those stories were connected with the 1886 revelation, but Lauren Woolley did connect those stories with the 1886 revelation. So Lauren Woolley by 1929 is the last man allegedly ordained to this Council of Friends. And so he goes and he calls a bunch of new men as counselors to be part of this Council of Friends. He's Leslie Broadbent, John Y. Barlow, Joseph Musser, Charles Zitting, LeGrand Woolley, and Lewis Kelch were the members of the Council of Friends that he organized. And I think this chart by Brian Hills is fairly good. The only, there are a couple things that I guess this isn't showing, but with James Harpston, the black box actually is supposed to be orange and say New Dispensation. Then with Eldon Kingston, the Kingstons, that black box is supposed to say New Dispensation. So there's a question mark whether Eldon Kingston was ordained second elder by Leslie Broadbent. But a friend of mine who's researcher actually reached out to the Kingstons to ask whether they claimed their authority from Leslie Broadbent and Lauren Woolley, or whether they claimed their authority from, this new dispensation experience that Eldon Kingston said he had, where he claimed to have the priesthood restored to him and given authority to the Kingston started their own church, and so they broke off from the fundamentalist movement fairly quickly, and they had their own church. But anyhow, so Lauren Woolley called men to this council of friends, and they became the predominant fundamentalist movement. And Leslie Broadbent was the guy in charge after Lauren Woolley died, and he passed away shortly after, and that was kind of unexpected. And after that, John Y. Barlow was the guy who was really in charge of the fundamentalists, and they started to have discussions about authority. And Brian Hales and Max Anderson kind of talk about some of the authority issues with fundamentalism, where fundamentalism did, there was there's statements that say the fundamentalists didn't claim to have authority to do X, Y, or Z thing, or didn't claim to have full authority, and they were only doing certain things that the church, they believed the church still had divine authority, but they believed that they were an independent priesthood work coexisting with the church to do a different function, is what the fundamentalist beliefs were. So John Y. Barlow was the next guy in charge, and there starts to be a split in the 1940s under John Y. Barlow over issues with placement marriage starting to happen in the late 1940s. And Joseph Musser, who was the next senior guy in the council, there starts to be a division between Joseph Musser and the other members of Lauren Woolley's Council of Friends in the late 1940s. And when after John Y. Barlow dies in 1949, Musser becomes the head of the council, and the Council of Friends kind of shuns Joseph Musser. And so he actually goes and he ordains a new Council of Friends. And that is the people that are listed in blue on this chart, Rulon Allred and, 6 other men who were ordained by Joseph Musser. And that's kind of where you get the first real big division in the fundamentalist movement. You had the Kingstons kind of broke off and had their division early, where they were kind of more of an independent movement. And there also were independent Woolleyites that started very early, because there were some who believed that Lauren Woolley actually gave keys to, they didn't give the presiding keys to any member of his council, but he actually gave them to a Lamanite prophet in the Yucatan that he claimed he was teleported to in the middle of the night. And so that was part of, that's where some independence, and you can actually see that on Brian Hill's chart, keys to Yucatan prophet independence. That's where that's where some independents first started splitting off. So you have the Kingston group split off, you have Musser split and starts his new council with Rulon Allred called as his second elder. And so that's what came to be the Allred group. While the other group, the original council, became like the FLDS. And so after Joseph Musser died, then it would be Leroy Johnson who was presiding over the FLDS. And then he dismissed 2 council members in 1963, Marion Hammond and Alma Timpson, and they went and they formed Centennial Park, while Rulon Jeffs became the leader of the FLDS after Leroy Johnson died. And then after him, he didn't actually call any other council members. And so after him, that's where Warren Jeffs and the FLDS church come down today from that original Woolley council from Lauren Woolley. And so then you also have the Centennial Park, who Marion Hammond and Alma Timpson formed their own breakoff, which came to be known as Centennial Park. And they're kind of live in that similar geographic area. They actually had a group breakoff from them. That was the Nelson Nailers, or the Third World Ward, who there are several hundred people in that group, I understand. So FLDS, several thousand. Centennial Park, I think, has a bit more, over 1,000. I'm not quite sure exact numbers. Another break off of the FLDS is the Blackmore group in Canada. So that's another interesting breakoff. I wonder if that's what he's referencing when he said that some broke off and became independents after Rule and Jeffs. Um, so that's kind of going off the FLDS side of the fundamental split. The AUB side, the all red Musser side of the split, there's Rule and all red, and they came to be known as the all red group or the AUB, and they're actually probably the biggest group today. I heard that they have over 8,000 members today, even though they've had several schisms break off from their group. So one of the early schisms that's mentioned in Brian Hale's chart is Gerald Peterson's broke off after Rulin Allred's death. He claimed he had been secretly ordained by Rulin, and that Rulin appeared to him after his death and commissioned him and he said he got commissioned to reorganize the church. And so that's where the Peterson group, or the righteous branch is what they're called. That's where they break off. There's a couple other breakoffs. Alex Joseph, I don't think he actually claimed authority from Rule and Allred, so I'll disagree with. He was more of an independent, so I'll disagree with that kind of linking him to Rule and Allred. There were other people who broke off after Owen Allred became the head of the council. There was a split with Joe Thompson, who got kicked off of the council over disagreements on various issues, and so that's where some of the Thompson groups down in Arizona trace their authority. There's been two other splits off of the AUB in the last 10 years or so. There was after Lynn Thompson became the head of the AUB. I think that was in 2014 or 2013, if I remember right. After Lynn Thompson became the head of the AUB, there were allegations of sexual abuse against him, and so many of the Montana community, the Pinesdale community, broke off, and so they're the AUB kind of second ward. And there also was a schism with a small group of AUB families that went out to Missouri and started kind of gathering in Missouri, and that small community near Stockton is called Humansville, and they're actually the groups of all the groups, we're talking about the major fundamentalist groups. The only groups that have ever built temples of fundamentalists, so this will be interesting to mainstream listening, is the Allred group. The Peterson group had built a temple, and the Missouri, the Humansville community are in the process of building a temple. So those are the only three groups that have actually built temples. Just to talk about some of the other smaller groups and lines, there's Robert Crossville. I don't think he didn't really claim authority from Leroy Johnson. He's the author of the second book of Commandments, Revelations, and he just had a small school of the prophets, and it wasn't really, never really a significant or large movement. With Jim Harpston, he claimed special that he was ordained by an angel, very similar to James Strang. And he started a church, the TLC church, which that church is not actually really extant anymore at any significant level. From listening to an interview with one of the apostles of Jim Harpston, they said that group at its peak probably had 1,000 members, or roughly 1,000 members, but that it's since Harpston's death is down to less than 50 people who still kind of believe in Jim Harpston's claims. The Kingston group's pretty big. They have thousands, I think at least 3,000 if I'm remembering accurate numbers, or I heard accurate numbers. So they've kind of grown and been very kind of successful in business, in that their group has really tried to be an economic cooperative where they really emphasize. So that's actually what they claim why they separated from the other fundamentalists, was that they wanted to have a successful United Order kind of economic program. And so they have tons of businesses in Salt Lake, and they've had controversy with with tax issues and law enforcement. So But yeah, they're another major group. So if you want to talk about the biggest groups, there's the AUB is probably the biggest. I'm not sure if either the Kingstons or the FLDS are in close for second or third place. Then there's Centennial Park, and then everything else is in the hundreds, at most, is what I understand about the other groups. So that's kind of explaining many of the major fundamentalist groups, except I guess without getting into the Liberans. And so I kind of say that I accept parts of the Lauren Woolley story. I believe that there were men set apart to do plural marriage, but the question arises: why don't I, go with one of those larger groups? Why do I find the Liberan claim of authority a bit more compelling than the Woolley story? Well, there's issues with the Lawrence Woolley story, as many will tell you. I think while they had a legitimate commission to plural marriage, that there were issues with the fundamentalists believing that they did not have full authority. And the authority issues that Max Anderson and Brian Hales bring up are only actually scratching the surface of the authority issues, where I've seen a number of statements of Rulon Allred saying that he didn't hold all the keys, and I've seen statements by other fundamentalists along those lines that they believed the only authority they held initially was to perform plural marriage, and there was an issue over where the one-man office in the priesthood was to directing everything, because in early Utah that was a big deal, was where is the presiding key holder or mouthpiece or prophet, whatever term you want to use. And in the 1930s, early fundamentalists are actually having issues with who holds all the keys, who is the presiding guy presiding over everything. And initially they asked John Y. Barlow, do you hold all the keys of the priesthood? And it's Musser recorded in his journal that he answered in the negative. And Musser basically said that he didn't know who held the keys, who was the one man holding the keys, but that he felt that the Lord would make it known to them eventually in a clear way. And then but by the late 1940s, fundamentalists some of them start to grow their authority, where I think by the 1940s John Y. Barlow started to kind of assert his authority, and then Musser after him. Musser was unique in that he was the only member of Lauren Woolley's Council of Friends who had received the second anointing, which confers the fullness of the priesthood in that ordinance. That was part of the apostles' claims to authority in Nauvoo. And so that was part of the issue between him and the old council, was that he was the only one who had the second anointing. And so he kind of believed that through having the second anointing and understanding the statements made in early church history about kings and priests being the kind of this highest authority that could be bestowed on man in the temple, and that confers, all the Brigham Young on one occasion said it conferred all the authority that one man can give to another. Musser came to believe that he had higher authority from being the only one who had a second anointing. And so Musser starts his new council, and he wants to give temple ordinances. He wants to give the second anointing to his new council. And this is an interesting, very fascinating historical issue among fundamentalists, and I've researched this quite extensively. And so he's preparing to give them temple ordinances to give them full authority. But from the evidence I've seen, there's a statement by Rulon Allred saying that Musser said that he'd been with the Lord, and the Lord told him not to give them their temple ordinances and second anointings. And there's other statements I've seen where Musser said that he didn't believe that he could do them outside of a temple. Retrospectively, when the AUB started, doing temple ordinances in the 1980s, there started to be a question of how did they have the authority to do that. And so retrospectively, some individuals wanted to look back on Musser taking men into a school of the prophets and doing rebaptisms, blessings on the head, washing their feet, and having them have their wives wash their feet. As some look back on that and said, hey, maybe that was the second anointing, but we didn't realize it at the time. And that's a fascinating issue. I've researched it in depth, and personally, I'm not I don't think that Musser had this, passed on the second anointing. I think there's a number of sources that say that wasn't the case. So yeah, I'm probably going to do I was hoping that a friend of mine who researched this a lot more than me would do a paper on this subject, but he's probably not going to ever release his paper or research on it. So I might have to, if there's enough interest, do some sort of research paper going into the details of that history. And so my issue with the Woolley line is that they don't claim to have the one man office, and there's issues with whether they claim to have full authority or not. And Robert, this is actually something fascinating that I noticed in your interview with Alma Allred, is that he mentioned interviewing Rulon Jeffs and asking him about temple authority. And Rulon Jeffs said that he had received his endowments in the church, but he did not think they had authority to do endowments or temple ordinances. And he didn't think that those would happen again until, the Jackson County events of God coming and everything, and Jesus returning and everything kind of getting set in order in Jackson County. So that was a fascinating interview that had that, that Alma shared that statement. I've collected a number of other statements like that. And so what was compelling to me personally about the LeBaron line is that I feel like, it's not just this chart making it look a lot cleaner, but I do think that the historical evidence for this claim to authority from Benjamin F. Johnson to Dare LeBaron to, and Dare passed the keys on to his sons after him is something that I personally found a bit more compelling than the Woolley story. And I found it compelling for a number of reasons. The first is that Benjamin F. Johnson did think that he held some sort of special authority. He never was a church leader. He never was an apostle. So some people question whether he had anything significant to give, or if he could actually give pass on, full authority and appoint his grandson Dare LeBaron to the authority, to be kind of the to hold all the keys and be the one man office in the priesthood. But I think those questions are resolved when you understand the Nauvoo teaching on the fullness of the priesthood, that anyone who who receives full temple ordinances as a king and a priest with the second anointing holds full authority. And Johnson did hold that. He was faithful in the church and he received that. And he also was a member of the Council of 50. And so, in my opinion, from my historical research, I think there's a lot of compelling reasons to think that the Council of 50 was intended to be a priesthood body, independent or above the church. And I know that's disputed, and that's not really a widely believed opinion, but I've collected quite a number of sources on this. Probably one of my longest pamphlets I did was a pamphlet on the Council of 50 as a priesthood body. And so that I felt was, compelling evidence when I looked at Lyman White said that the Council of 50 was a presiding priesthood body above the church. I saw Alpheus Cutler made statements along those lines. I found in the Council of 50 Minutes that Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball made interesting statements about that. Just a lot of variety of sources on that subject, kind of, in my opinion, lended credibility to this idea that Benjamin F. Johnson is one of the members of the 50 who was given the last charge to see that Joseph Smith's teachings and theology was perpetuated, would have felt that he could have been in a position to pass on full authority to someone else. And with the LeBaron story, what's very different from it to the Woolley story is that there's antagonistic witnesses that state that Dare was making that support Dare's claim. For Dare LeBaron's priesthood claim, it's very difficult and frustrating to study the LeBarons because there isn't a whole lot of written sources before the late 1940s, early 1950s. But in the 1950s and 1960s, Lyle O'Wright, who was a researcher, I think he was a professor at BYU. He did his master's thesis on the origin and development of the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, which is the LeBaron Church organized in Mexico. And he went back and he interviewed different people and reached out and Margarita Bautista, who was a fundamentalist leader who had no connection with Dare or accepted the LeBaron's priesthood authority. He was involved with Musser's New Council. He wrote that he remembered that back as early as 1910 to 1913, Dare LeBaron was telling him that, that Johnson had given him he was making his claims that early. And he said that Dare's son's making those claims was nothing new to him. And so he's a hostile, antagonistic witness, and he kind of offers a little bit of support to the fact that Dare was telling people about this, 10 years before Lauren Woolley started making his claims. And then the other interesting thing for me was that he also reached out to Dare LeBaron's brother, Conway LeBaron, who was a mainstream member of the church, and asked Conway what he knew about things. And Conway confirmed several of Dare's stories. He said that Johnson did give Dare a special blessing, and that blessing was always a sore spot to the Benjamin F. Johnson family. So, just, very interesting things. And we actually see Dare from, a very early time start, there's no doubt about him claiming full authority and, claiming to hold the one-man office in the priesthood. And where the LeBaron story goes after that is a whole other discussion, whole other issue. But I think, the two churches that really came out of LeBaron, came from Dare LeBaron are, there's Ross LeBaron's church, Church of the Firstborn, then Joel LeBaron's church, Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. I think so Joel's church, just to give a brief summary, he makes his claim. He and Ervil published Priesthood Expounded in 1956, and they actually grow to be a significant group. But what I didn't find very interesting was that their doctrine was just basic fundamentalist doctrine without anything really special or unique really to Joel's teachings about, there's like plural marriage, united order, very, same stuff that you'd hear from any other fundamentalist. But they were really big on missionary work, and because they did claim to have the authority to to set up their own church and to do everything, they did get a lot of converts, and that church grew to several thousand people up to the 1970s, when that all basically collapsed into violence with Ervil LeBaron and the bloodshed that unfortunately happened in connection with Joel's church. And that he started by killing Joel, and then he had a number of other people killed. It's speculated that Verlin, who was the second in command of Joel's church, was also possibly murdered. He died in a car accident in 1981. And so but Verlin, by the late 1970s, actually kind of disincorporated or disorganized the church because they didn't feel like they could continue after Joel's death fully. And so there's several factions. That church kind of broke up into different fractions, none of them really believing they have full authority, because Joel's only real unique teaching that that was the big part of his claim, was claiming to hold the right of the firstborn, or was the term he used for the one-man office over the priesthood. And he basically said that office it was a self-perpetuating office, was his theology, where the office needs to directly appoint its next successor. But he died without appointing a successor. And so taking kind of the one-man doctrine to that extreme was the downfall of Joel's church. And similar to James Strang's church, where James Strang said to be the prophet, you need to be ordained by an angel, and no one after him was ordained. And so James Strang's church fell apart after his death. But there are probably still hundreds of people who believe, or descendants of the Mexico LeBarons, who still believe in his claims and his teachings to some degree. So the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Time still is extant to some degree down in Mexico. And so Ross LeBaron was different in that his church was in Utah, and he actually did have kind of unique theological teachings where he felt that his church should be structured different than the LDS church, where he actually kind of felt that later on he got he made a statement that he felt the Church of Jesus Christ was the organization for to to teach the first principles of the gospel or principles of salvation, and that his church, the Church of the Firstborn, had the mission of teaching like the higher principles of exaltation. So he did, in some degree, believe that the LDS Church was, still had a purpose and still had some, degree of authority in his ministry, and that he felt that his work was different, and that the Church of Jesus Christ was more of it was not a family organization. He called it a Gentile order where there was wards and stakes, where he felt the Church of the Firstborn was to be a family organization, a patriarchal organization where men held authority to basically have a family kingdom, and everyone had to kind of be linked back into adopted. He was really big on the law of adoption, which is a principle of early Mormonism that ended in the 1890s. And Ross LeBaronites were the first ones in fundamentalism to really practice the law of adoption after it hadn't been practiced in over 75 years, I think. So Ross was very fascinating, and part of the thing that I felt was compelling about Ross and what Ross taught and what his follower Fred Collier wrote on. He published a lot of pamphlets that really kind of expanded on, and he said he got revelations that expanded on Ross's theology. As I felt that there was a very unique and compelling claim to continuing revelation there that you don't really see too much in other fundamentalists. Most fundamentalists just want to point back to what Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor taught, and I think that's fine to be true to what they taught. But I also think continuing revelation is an important principle as well. And I think one Christopher Blythe wrote a thesis on Ross LeBaron that kind of had some positive things to say about how he was he was a religious innovator, is what he called him, where he felt that that Ross LeBaron had kind of a very unique and creative outlook to theology that was very similar to, I'm not sure if he compared him to Joseph Smith, but I personally think that it was very similar to, the unique theological inventiveness that you see in Joseph Smith and Brigham Young about, getting into the mysteries, as it's called. And so you kind of see that a little bit with Lauren Woolley, where Lauren Woolley claimed, he made a lot of various interesting claims, but the historical claims Lauren Woolley made are where a lot of people don't find them very credible. And so, I can understand that, but I still think Lauren Woolley, he kind of was a theological innovator as well, where he had some unique religious ideas, but I don't think his priesthood claims really fit church history. While Ross taught things about priesthood that I think kind of have similarities to what Joseph Smith was doing. So, I guess that's kind of summarizing what I think about the various fundamentalist groups. I guess I can share where I think the weaknesses of fundamentalism are, if you think that'd be. Do you have any other questions before I go to that?
Yeah, maybe if you were like just share like the weaknesses, and we can wrap up. And if there's like interest, maybe we could do like a round two, just like a comp. We're going for like 2.5 hours. So
yeah, we're going strong. So I'm yeah. Thanks for your patience, and this is just a lot of different material to cover, but so I think my criticisms of fundamentalism, to kind of keep it brief, is fundamentalists generally have not been very big on missionary work, when I think the revelations to Joseph Smith and the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and John Taylor really emphasized the importance of missionary work. A second thing that I think fundamentalists are kind of weak on is the word of wisdom. Brigham Young really actually emphasized that the saints needed to be better about it, and that was something the early brethren did think was important, but that there was a leniency to it, where they felt it was more the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, and it wasn't super strictly enforced until Heber J. Grant, but it still was important. And I think I've heard on your Alma Allred interview where he was surprised that a lot of fundamentalists really, and he said that Rulon Jeffs actually even told him that we think some commandments are more important than others, is why they didn't believe in really obeying the word of wisdom. So I think the other issue with fundamentalism is the lack of unity. The constant schisms is, I think, a real weakness for fundamentalism. And that's where one of the ways that, just like with missionary work and the word of wisdom, the LDS church would, to many people, I think, appear more compelling in that there's, it's not having constant schisms, and the ecclesiastical structure is, a lot more concrete, and you're not going to have major shakeups. It's got that stability, I guess, is what that, that's one thing the church has going for it. Very, that's better than the fundamentalists. I would criticize fundamentalists when it comes to the temple ordinances. Those who began doing temple ordinances, some of them, some degree, don't actually follow they don't really pay attention to the regulations that, that Brigham Young taught about it. And, in saying that, I mean, like some fundamentalists, so I think, the TLC group and some of the other groups also do temple ordinances to some degree. But Brigham Young said that, higher temple ordinances ideally needed to be done in a temple. And he said certain things shouldn't be done outside of a temple. Like, he said endowment work for the dead and the law of adoption or parent-child sealings were things that shouldn't be done outside of temples. But many fundamentalists have kind of disregarded those, teachings. And, the importance of temples is another one that's kind of been disregarded to some degree. With fundamentalism, this is another one, is that some fundamentalists are pretty big on prophetic infallibility. And so that's part of the reason I think some of them just jump from John Taylor to John Woolley and skip over Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, and Joseph F. Smith and just say that Woolley was the next key holder after John Taylor, because they don't want to have any issues with the idea that a prophet could be fallible or could be mistaken or could go astray. And so you see the error, you see the most destructive aspect of prophetic infallibility in, say, Warren Jeffs and the stuff that the stuff he did that was so destructive to his followers, and different things that he did that were, very immoral, and that he only got away with because of trying to claim infallibility and claiming and teaching blind obedience to the priest. And there are other groups that to lesser degrees teach, really emphasize prophetic the prophet couldn't fall, or that you really need to just focus on obeying your leader. But definitely the FLDS were the worst offenders in that regard. And so, yeah, I personally, there's some things in fundamentalism that I think that where fundamentalism is today, it is still very much in a fragmented, let's see, where's my other tab? Let's go to interview with Robert Boyd. So I think that Joseph Smith was intending there to be some sort of different organization of the church than what it was in, how it was in the 1840s. He mentioned that he wanted there to be a different organization after the temple was completed. People got to be initiated into the temple ordinances. And I don't think that kind of idea was ever, fully accomplished. I think Brigham Young tried to, with the law of adoption on the Trek West, tried to do some of these principles, but I don't think that, this idea of a separate, distinct organization, which Kimball mentioned in the Nauvoo Temple, where he said that there was supposed to be a different order and government once people were brought into and initiated into the temple ordinances. I think that idea is something that, was in embryo in Utah and Nauvoo and on the Trek West, but never fully, this kind of a dual organization where there was a lower organization where, where you're taught the first principles, and then a higher organization where the saints were initiated into the temple doctrines and, more esoteric priesthood things. I don't think that those things have ever been fully established as much as I would like to see. And, the idea that, I would hope in the future that fundamentalists could eventually get things together in a more cohesive way to accomplish those things, because Joseph Smith made comments about, the fullness of the blessings and the fullness of the priesthood couldn't be accomplished except through a gathering, through proper organization, through temples, through through doing all of these different principles that he was introducing in Nauvoo. And so while, I see the church as, improve is having its positives versus fundamentalists, and fundamentalists having some positives versus the church, I don't see fundamentalists as fully accomplishing those things yet either. Just if that kind of makes sense. I look forward to the day I hope to see fundamentalism be, I hope to see things develop in a more positive way. And I hope we can learn from the past mistakes in fundamentalism where there's been issues with, bad leadership, bad doctrines, and different issues that have come from that. So.
Oh no, that's pretty good. So because I'll have to head because I'm still in the office. What books would you recommend on, like, say, a general introduction to Mormon fundamentalism? Like, there's a book I'm rather fond of, written by my friend Craig Foster and Marianne Watson, American Fundamentalism. And he kind of mentioned Brian Hills. He has his book, Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, I believe it's called, which I thought was pretty good. But what resources would you recommend to get like a good, neutral, not really like polemical overview, like, say, fundamentalism or research such thing?
So I agree with you, and I think that Craig Foster and Marianne Watson's book, that book is excellent history, and it's very balanced, and it's good because it's two different perspectives of an apologist and a fundamentalist writing that book, and so that one is good. The book The Fundamentalist: A History of Colorado City is another good one. Let me try to pull up the author real quick. That's another good book. That's by Benjamin Benjamin Beisling, who wrote that book. That's another good one. For LeBaron history, I would say a really strong academic history of the LeBaron line hasn't been written yet. I'm personally working on some research projects and writing projects relating to that. But if you wanted to get a history of LeBaronism, a kind of a devotional apologetic book, the LeBaron Story by Verlin LeBaron is pretty good, and a lot of its history, and it even goes up to cover some of the violence with Ervil LeBaron and where Ervil LeBaron went wrong and did what led him to do a lot of the awful things he did. So that's a good history. A book that came out that's really good is kind of accompanying that is by Dwayne Haven, called God's Executioner: The Ervil LeBaron Tragedy, which is kind of, he wrote it as saying, this is my insider perspective as a member of the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times, and who knew Joel LeBaron and knew Verlin LeBaron and Ervil LeBaron. And so he got to give kind of a very unique perspective. But the best kind of academic history, I would say, that's kind of by a non-believer of LeBaronism would be, I mentioned Lyle O'Wright's thesis on the origins and developments of the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. And so those are all really, really good books. I definitely think that, what was the name of the title again? Craig Foster and Marianne. I know I have the book on my shelf, but
I
American
believe it's
Polygamy.
called, yeah, American.
Yeah, American Polygamy: A History of Fundamentalist Mormon Faith, I think is, that's really recent and really up to date and has a lot of great history in it. So, and then for resources, Brian Hill's Mormon Polygamy Documents or he has the Mormon Polygamy Documents about Joseph Smith's polygamy, but then he has Mormon Fundamentalism Documents, which is an amazing resource that just has a ton of information relating to fundamentalists and fundamentalist beliefs. So,
Oh no, perfect. And because I have to head, I'll actually have to end this soon. But like, Jacob, thanks again for coming on. I really do appreciate it. So, And I do look forward
Yeah,
to the forthcoming dialogue. Hopefully, we'll have later this year on Adam God. That should be interesting.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
So,
sure. And hopefully we'll have you on again, like in the near future, to discuss some other topic. But until then, thanks for everyone for tuning in live. And if you watch this later, hope you enjoy the episode. And